Let's open our Bibles to Acts chapter 2 this evening. Acts chapter 2, and the verse is 46. When we look at the church in the first century as it then had its beginning, we find that they met a lot more than what we meet today. It was really a daily meeting, and that's what we're going to notice here in Acts chapter 2 and verse 46. And as we look then at the situation, they were there. They gathered to Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, Acts chapter 2 and verse 1. And they stayed for a number of days. This feast then that the Jews were at Jerusalem for continued for a number of days. So this is something that would be normal. But these people stayed longer. If you look at Acts chapter 4, we're going to come back to Acts chapter 2 in just a minute. But the latter part then of Acts chapter 4, about verse 34, it says, "Neither was there any among them that lacked, for as many as were possessors of lands and houses sold them and brought the pieces of the things that were sold and laid them down at the apostles' feet. And distribution was made to every man according as he had need." And their money was running out as they stayed there over the length of time. They had made preparations for the length of time for the feast then of Pentecost. And then after that, their money was running out and they were staying there. They were trying to learn more about what they need to be doing. So when they went home, go back to Acts chapter 2 now, and when you find that there were dwelling at Jerusalem Jews, devout men out of every nation under heaven. And so these people then came to Jerusalem, and he mentions all these places. Verse 9, Parthians, Medes, Elamites, dwellers at Mesopotamia, Judah, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, and parts of Libya, Cyrene, and strangers of Rome, Jews and proselytes, Cretes and Moravians. So there are people then from all nations. Okay, so they were gathering together. But look at verse 46 of this chapter, Acts chapter 2, verse 46. "And they, continuing daily with one accord in the temple, breaking bread from house to house, did eat their meat with gladness and singleness of heart." And this breaking of bread, and look at verse 42, "And they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship and a breaking of bread." That's not the same breaking of bread. One's a common meal. I think verse 46 is a common meal, and verse 42 is the Lord's Supper. And you have to look, when it talks about breaking of bread, you have to look at the context. Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, upon the first day of the week when the disciples came together to break bread, that's not a common meal. That is the Lord's Supper. When you look then at Acts chapter 20, you do find that they broke bread. That was a common meal. So context tells us then what they were doing. So I want us to look at this. First of all, the church then had time together. That's what we're focusing our attention on to this evening. Okay? Maybe other reasons, but the church had time together. The church must meet. You know, in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 25, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another so much the more as you see the day approaching. You know, there is this idea that some do forsake, and it's not a new problem, but the church then must meet together to worship God. Yes, you can worship God and ought to worship God individually during the week, but there comes a time when the church must come together and must worship God in spirit and in truth. There is a purpose for that. There is benefit from that, from us worshiping together. We're noticing then some illustrations that show this is true, and that's what we're going to notice this evening is some illustrations. I have another sermon entitled Metaphors of the Church, and it is along the same line that show that the church then, the unity of the church, okay? Very interesting when we notice these things and how the church is to be united, how the church is to work together. All of these illustrations are going to notice that. And the first one is found in John chapter 15. John chapter 15. We begin with verse 1. I am the vine, and my Father is the husbandman. Every branch in me that beareth not fruit, he taketh away, and every branch that beareth fruit, he purgeth it, and it may bring forth more fruit. Now ye are clean through the word that I have spoken unto you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself, except it abide in the vine, no more can ye, except ye abide in me. I am the vine, ye are the branches. He that abideth in me, and I in him, the same bring forth much fruit. For without me ye can do nothing. If a man abide not in me, he is cast forth as a branch, and is withered. And men gather them and cast them into the fire, and they are burned. If ye abide in me, and my word abide in you, ye shall ask what ye will, and it shall be done unto you. And as we go through this, the reoccurring word is abide. Now, I want us to look at verse 6, notice some things that some people have manipulated this and used this falsely. And because there are people in the religious world that will say that these different religious organizations are the branches off of the true vine. That's not what this passage says. Okay, it says if a man, not different religious organization, but if a man abide not in me. So we're talking about individuals here. We're not talking about different religious organizations. Here is then individual. We've got to abide in the vine. We are a branch. He is the vine. And we've got to abide in that. Now, our nourishment, there's a lot of things that probably some of you could speak on this more than I can about abiding in there and the nourishment that it gets from that. I know this, that, I've got some vines out there, and if I cut the vines at the bottom, it dies upward, but then I've got to cut it up here because it's so thick going out to my woods that I've got to have a pathway through there. Be that as it may, but if you cut it down at the bottom, you know that everything above that's going to die because it's not getting the nourishment, it's not getting the water, it's not getting what it needs then. And sunlight is important too. The nourishment, the water, and the sunlight are all important, but this is... we've got to abide in him. Now, focus your attention on verse 4. And notice how many times the word abide is used. Now, when you find in the Bible that the word is over and over again, it is important. Abide in me, and I in you. There's one. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself, except it abide, that's two, in the vine. No more can ye, except ye abide in me. 3 times in that one verse that it says abide. So abiding is important. I think maybe some translations may have abode. I'm not sure about that. But the meaning then, if we look it up, of abide means to continue to be present. So that branch has got to be continued to be in the presence of the vine in order for it to produce. And that's what he says then. If a man abide not in me, he is cast forth as a branch and is withered. And then men gather them and cast them into the fire, and they are burned. And I've got a big burn pile out there where these things have been cut off, and I'm going to, burn them. And that's what we do. We understand that. So here is the first illustration of that idea of abiding. Here is the church then meeting together and that time that we need to be together. Here's one illustration. Number 2 is the family. Now I want us to turn. This is very interesting then. 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15. Okay, but if I tarry long, that thou mayest know how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God. Now he's going to tell us about that house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and the ground of the truth. Now he's telling us how we ought to behave. But I've tarried long that thou knowest how thou ought to behave thyself in the house of God. I had one man come to me one time and asked me to preach a sermon on behavior in the house of God. And I thought, why do you want me to deal with the behavior of some folks in the house of God? And some people need this. Okay? But when we look at the house of God, I want you to think of a house. I want you to think of a family. Now, this house of God is very interesting as we look back in Isaiah chapter 2. Okay? And here's the foundation of this house of God. In Isaiah 2, beginning with verse 2, it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow into it. And many people shall go and say, Come ye, let us go up into the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. So here's twice, the Lord's house, and then the house of the God of Jacob. And he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So this is going to happen in the last days. Then the church is going to be established, or the Lord's house is going to be established. Okay? That's verse 2. So we know when and we know what's going to be established. And then in verse 3, all nations then, let us go up to the mountain, the house of God. This is all the same thing. And we notice that it's going to be in Jerusalem, but not only in Jerusalem, it's going to be in Mount Zion. So he's talking about then the house of God, which really is a representation of the family. Okay? And how important is family? Now, we mentioned the fathers this morning in the Father's Day sermon, but the family is very important. As the family goes, the nation goes. Really, we could say as the family goes, the church goes. When there's a breakup of the family, then the church will start beginning to have problems, and the nation then also will have problems. So we need to make sure and teach what the Bible says about the family of God. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 18, it says, And the Lord God said, It is not good that man should be alone. I will make an help meet for him, or a helper suitable for him. So in the family, we have companionship. And when we look at the church as a family of God, there is then companionship. We need to be helping one another to go to heaven. Again, in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24, Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. So here's the church then. It's the family of God. And the family then, I know it needs to meet together. Children sometimes get older, and I know in the high school years they have that tendency to, not to be at home, but still there is that time. Family reunions are important. To see one another, and idea of funerals. We always make this statement of funerals, we need to get together more often. And who is going to make this, let's do this. All right, let's meet at such and such. Some people always, not all people can do that. So it's still important. Family is important. The husband, the wife, the husband, the head of the house, the father, then you have the wife, and then the children. And there is God's scheme for the family. The husband is to love the wife is to love the husband, and the children are to obey. And the father is to bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. So there is then the family connection here that we find. All right, should be number 3. And when I think of this, I think of the Vacation Bible School. I'm in the Lord's Army. Okay. I may never march in the infantry, shoot the artillery, or fly over the enemy, but I'm in the Lord's army. So I really like that. And there is the idea of us being in the Lord's army. Let's look at Ephesians chapter 6. And here is then the armor. Although it does not say we're in the Lord's army, you don't have the armor without being in the army. Okay? And there's some other passages that we're going to notice. I want to begin with verse 11. Really, we could begin with verse 10. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, against principalities, against powers, against rulers of darkness in this world, against spiritual wickedness in the high place. Wherefore, take unto you the whole armor of God. Now, he's told us in verse number 11 to put on the whole armor of God. And verse 13, he says, wherefore, take unto you the whole armor of God. How important is the whole armor of God? It is very important that ye may be able to stand. Now, watch this. Here's something else. Not only does he say to put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand, number one, in the evil day, and having done all to stand, there's number two. Now watch how he begins verse 14. Stand therefore. So our stance is also important. Having your loins girded about with truth, having on the breastplate of righteousness, your feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace, and above all take the shield of faith, wherewith ye shall be able to quench the fiery darts of the wicked, and take a helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. So here is our equipment, then, for fighting the devil. You need to understand that. Now let's go to another passage, 2 Timothy chapter 2. And we can begin with verses 3 and 4. I think this is an interesting chapter when we look at this. If you look at verse 1, he says to be strong. Now, how are we going to be strong? Well, beginning with verse 3, thou therefore endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. So there's hardness. Now, I've talked to some people who have been in the military, served in Korea, served in Vietnam, and I have talked to POWs from World War II. And there was hardness. In every case, they had to endure hardness as a soldier. And they tried to prepare. I know they tried to prepare you for all of these things. They can't prepare you in every instance. But here is then Paul trying to tell Timothy, you need to be prepared as a good soldier. There's going to be some things that, you're going to have to endure. Right now, no man, verse 4 says, no man that warreth entangleth himself with the affairs of this life. So we got to have a single focus then. And by that, I mean, we don't have to all be preachers, but we've got to have this focus of going to heaven. What does it take for me to go to heaven? Okay? And that's what we need to be working on. That he may please him who hath chosen him to be a soldier. Verse 5, for if a man strive for the mastery, yet he is not crowned, except he strive lawfully. And if we go through this chapter, we can find these words that begin with S, and they then are good, help us to be a good soldier. We're not to strive, all right, chosen him to be a good soldier, and then strive. If we look down in verse 9, suffer. Look at verse 12 again, suffer. Verse 15, study. And verse 16, shun. So there's some things then that we look at this to help us to be a good soldier. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 4, it tells us that our weapons of this warfare are not carnal. So we're not in a physical fight, we're in a spiritual fight. And if we look again at Ephesians chapter 6, it helps us then understand we're fighting against the wiles of the devil. The devil then is throwing the darts. He's doing everything that he can to attack us. And 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8, we need to understand he's as a roaring lion walking about, seeking whom he may devour. We need to be prepared then for the enemy. And we need to know our enemy and who he is and what he is about. We need to be trained to use our weapons. And as in the military, they teach you to clean your weapon. They teach you to use that weapon. And I think we need to train to use our Bibles. I see Bible study as the training ground for the church. If we study at home, we're learning more about our weapon, the sword of the Spirit. If we're studying together, we're learning more about the weapons. All of these things we need to be spending time with. But the army then works together. And the more it works together, the more successful it will be. And an army of one is not, it gets discouraging sometimes to be that army of one. And that the Bible tells us that two are better than one because of that. So we need to be a part of the Lord's army. Next, then, is the body. And when I looked online about to have this, I could have gone in a lot of different directions on this. And I look at the body, and it's got all the different systems. We could have put something like that, and I thought, that's not really what I want. All these systems, we know we have different systems. We have the respiratory system. We have the circulatory system. We have, there's a number of systems that we have, and they're working together. And the Bible uses the body as an illustration. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 12 then. This is also a shorter version of this. It's found in Romans chapter 12. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, though, beginning with verse 12 and continuing then through most of the rest of the chapter, it has to deal with the idea of the body. For as the body is one and hath many members, and all the members of that one body being many are one body, so also is Christ. So we're part of the body. For by the one Spirit were you baptized into one body, whether you be Jew or Gentile, be bond or free, and have been all made to drink of that Spirit, into that one Spirit. So here is, and you can't, if you cut off the finger, then it's going to die. It needs to be a part of the body. Okay? Verse 14. For the body is not one member, but many. If the foot shall say, because I am not the hand, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? How important are your feet? To show you how important it is, stub your little toe. Okay? You don't have to do the big one, just the little one. You'll find out how important that is. Okay? The feet are very important. Diabetics have to be really careful with their feet because of the circulation. And they're important because when it really is your movement, motion. You really have problems with that. If the ear shall say to the body, because I am not the eye, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? And to me, here, the ear and the eye have two different functions. Okay? Both of them are important. If you can't hear, or if you have some hearing impairment, and if you have eyes and you have seeing impairment, you understand those things. You can't hear and you can't see. Man can help with that. Glasses will help with that. And I've been wearing glasses for, a long time. Okay? But it's still not, the seeing with the naked eye without any help is still better than seeing with glasses. Hearing without the aid of hearing aids, if you could hear and you have good hearing, that's better than having hearing aids. There's still some things there. Part of the body, one cannot say, I'm more important than the other. Think about those things. How important each one of these things. If the whole body were an eye, where were the hearing? If the whole were a hearing, where were the smelling? And now hath God set the members, every one of them in the body, if it hath pleased him. We all have a function, and we all need to be doing their functions. That's like the systems in the body. Every system needs to be working. And if one doesn't work, we get into trouble. That's like the church. All the systems need to be working together. And he goes back then in verse 21, the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of thee, nor can again the head say to the feet, I have no need of you. Nay, much more, those members of the body which seem to be feeble are necessary, and those members of the body which think they are less honorable, upon these we bestow more abundant honor. And if our uncomely parts have more abundant comeliness, for our comely parts have no need, but God hath tempered the body together, having given more abundant honor to that part which lacketh. So everybody is important in the church. Everything works together for this. Okay? And no one can say, I have no need of you. So it all worked together. And here's the church then. It is the body of Christ. And we've seen that in this. Now, next illustration is the yoke. And we lose a lot of, the Bible, when the Bible was written, that was an agricultural society. And we're losing some of our illustrations because we're no longer a agricultural society. The yoke, I don't know a lot about the yoke. I've seen yokes, never have worked with animals in a yoke, and never have worked with animals like that. But it is important. I know the Old Testament says that you don't put two different kinds of animals together into a yoke because they need to work together. Okay, and that's the whole idea. Now, our passage for this is found in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30. He says, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke." Okay, so a yoke then implies some things. It implies, number one, that there's going to be work involved. Now, not all work is the same kind of work. Pulling an empty wagon is not the same thing as pulling a wagon full of, say, hay. I mean, you can put a wagon on the back of your truck and you know the difference. If you have an empty wagon, it's one thing. Then you fill it for whatever, you go get building materials or whatever you go. And you can tell that there's something behind you and it takes more gas to get, same thing with animals. They understand that. Okay. So take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest to your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So when we are yoked up with Jesus, we are laborers together with him. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 9. We find that when we're yoked up with the Lord, it's not as a heavy burden as what it seems to be. I've been reading on my daily Bible reading. I finished up this morning the book of Nehemiah, and to me that's a very interesting study. Nehemiah is the cupbearer to the king, and he comes down. He understands that his city of his fathers is laying in waste, and the city walls. And his job is to build the city's wall. Ezra is to build the temple, and his job was to build the walls. Protection. So they rebuild the walls in 52 days, is what the book, for the people. And here's the thing, in Nehemiah chapter 4 and verse 6, for the people had a mind to work. And when you study the book of Nehemiah, it wasn't always smooth sailing. They had problems. They had Sanballat and Tobiah and another individual, and they were attacking them any way that they could. They sent letters back. They tried to get them to stop. There were problems upon problems upon problems. There was, they had mortgaged everything that they had. They were being charged usury. There's just a lot of problems that they were going on in that time. So it was not easy sailing, but they had a mind to work. They were yoked up. They had to build, with their swords to their side. But they had a mind to work. And that's what we need in the church today. We need to be yoked together, and we need to know that here is our mission, and here's what we need to do. And we need to be doing the Lord's work. We have a mind to work. Then next, and finally, is the temple. Now, we've mentioned this to some extent. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 16 and 17. Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? If any man defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy, for the temple of God is holy, which temple ye are. Okay, so here is the temple. Now, the temple, when we think of temple, we need to be thinking of worship. Okay, and in the Old Testament, they came to either the the tabernacle. We could have used the tabernacle as the same thing because the tabernacle was a forerunner of the temple, but they used that as their place of worship. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5, ye also as lively stones are built up a spiritual house and holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God, to Jesus Christ. And here's something else. A lot of times we get our idea that we're to go into all the world and preach the gospel, which is true. But notice also, we are a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, and here's the thing, to offer up spiritual sacrifices. So another job, if you please, another purpose of the church is to offer up spiritual sacrifices to God. Verse 9, also it says, you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, and holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praises of him that called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Okay. Now, the question is, could the priests do their job without meeting and without coming to the temple? You know, that's where they were to do their work. Go back and read. When the priesthood was established, I'm talking about the Levitical priesthood, it was at the tabernacle or it was at the temple. And that's where they were doing. They had to meet there to do their job. Sometimes they had more job than, they had to have some help. And they got the Levites to help them. So here then is what God wanted under the Old Testament. So what about us in the New Testament? We are the spiritual house of God, and we need to be meeting together. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir tonight, but we need to hear this. And maybe it's encouraging to us, but here is why we are to meet. All right, now, let's draw this to a conclusion. Cooperation will always help the work of the church. When we've got the church focused on where we need to be going, what we need to be doing, that will help the church to grow and to be the kind of church that it needs to be, to offer up our sacrifices and our worship to God. Now, the Bible asks, are you for the Lord? Or are you against him? If we're not for him, we're scattering abroad. Okay? If we're not for the Lord, guess who we're for? There's only two choices here. Then we're for the devil. So we need to be for the Lord. Now, the Lord has work for us to do. Okay? And we've looked at that work in our illustrations this evening. Each one of these had a work. The family, or the vine, the family, the army, the body, the yoke, and the temple. All of these then have a work to do. And are you a part of the work? And that may be a better question. Are you a part of the work? If you're not part of the work, what are you waiting for? You can be a part of the work of the Lord. But you've got to submit. Now we go back to 1 Timothy chapter 2, and he says you've got to strive lawfully. Now, to enter into the army, there is a right way to enter the army, and there is a wrong way. Okay? I can't put on a uniform and act like I'm in the military, any part of the military. I don't have the training. The same thing, you may act like you're part of the Lord's army, but unless you enter into the Lord's army in the lawful way, you're not part of the Lord's army. And the way we enter into this army is by believing that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, by repenting of our sins, by confessing, and by being baptized. That puts us in the Lord's army, and we can do the work then of all these things. The vine, we can do the work of the vine. We can be part of the family. We're adopted into that family. The body, the yoke, and the temple. You can be that this evening. Maybe you've done those things, but you left. You need to come back because you're not being profitable for the Lord, and we need to be profitable for our work in the Lord. So if you're here tonight in our assembly and need to respond, we're going to ask you to do that while we sing. If you're part of Facebook and watching on Facebook, then if you need to respond, let us know, and we will help you in any way that we can. So let's think about this while together we stand and as we sing.